So it's on page 921 by the looks of it, of the Black Bibles. Philippians 1, 12 to 30. Philippians chapter 1, verse 12. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard, and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defence of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance, as it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, and that with full courage now, as always, Christ will be honoured in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labour for me. Yet which I shall choose I cannot tell. I am hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith, so that in me you may have ample cause to glory in Christ Jesus, because of my coming to you again. Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel, and not frightened in anything by your opponents. This is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that from God. For it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you shall not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake, engaged in the same conflict that you saw I had, and now hear that I still have.
Amen. Friends, I wonder if you've ever worried about anything. I'm sure you haven't, and that you are not worriers at all. So let me describe to you what worrying is, because you clearly have no experience of it, worrying, do you? For those who can't imagine it, let me paint a picture of worry. Here's a few different types of worry. There's middle of the night worry, when you go to bed soundly and you just wake up at 3:07 thinking about the thing that you haven't done, or the thing you should have done, or the thing that you're going to do. It doesn't matter. There's that worry, middle of the night worry, just so you can imagine what it's like. There's lawnmower worry. So sometimes a mindless task like mowing the lawn is refreshing. You know, those times you're out on the mower, it's fun, you're achieving something, nothing to think about. There's other times when the mower is the worst thing you could be doing, because it is completely mindless, and as you mow the lawn, you keep on, it's like the spinning blades are going in your mind. Lawnmower worry, you know those ones? There's improv worry, when you are just improvising in your mind situations that have not yet happened, but you're worrying about them. So you're actually using your imagination to worry. There's those times, maybe, I'm sure you can. And then there's inverse worry. There's times when you don't worry about things, and you should be worrying about them, and then they become a worry for you. Okay, so they can be middle of the night worry, improv worry, any of those. Even about things that don't really affect you, we can worry, can't we? That's the way it goes. The Philippians are some people with some things to worry about. Last week we heard they were a church and that they put joy into the heart of Paul at the very thought of them. It brought joy to Paul as he prayed for them. But life is real and hard, and life for a Christian in that time was real and hard, and maybe we could say life in our time as a Christian is real and hard. Paul wrote from prison. He knows that those Philippians too won't be outside of the crucible. And so Paul writes now to encourage them. Does he give them a pep talk? Does he say, you lot are bigger than this? You know, you're going to stamp all over it. You've got it. I believe in you. Is that what he says? No, actually. What does God say when we are tempted to worry? It's actually not, you are bigger than those things. It's something else. What does God say when the storm clouds of worry gather on our horizon? Well, let's dive in. There'll be 3 points, as there mostly always is. Number 1, let's look at the king over the worry. Remember who Paul is. Remember what he writes as his occupation. He is a travelling, church-planting missionary. It's what he does. All over the Mediterranean, he carries the gospel to people. Being free to travel is kind of part and parcel with being a travelling church-planting missionary, okay? I'm sure being imprisoned upsets any of our jobs, really, but this one especially. But Paul wants them to know, on second thoughts, being imprisoned, even though you're a travelling church-planting missionary, it might not actually mean it's over. Paul writes to the Philippians to tell them that they shouldn't worry about the persecution that's come to him. They shouldn't think this is the end of what he does. They care about his mission work because they're partners in the gospel. Remember that from last week? They care because they want to see Paul travel because he came to them. Remember, if we read Acts, remember we did that 2 weeks ago. There's a vision, they travelled over to see them. They care about being able to travel around the Mediterranean. They care also about Paul and the trouble that he's in because that could equally come knocking on their door. So they care about him. But Paul says, I don't want you to worry about it. Far from it, actually. Verse 12, he says, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. Looks like my travelling days are over, but don't worry, it's not going to affect the gospel. For 2 reasons, he says. Firstly, in chapter 13, he says, don't worry, that it has really served to advance the gospel so that it's become known through the whole imperial guard and to the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. He says, every day I get to hang out with probably different blokes who are under orders to be with me. They might even be chained to him. They think Paul is stuck there with them. Paul would say, no, they're stuck here with me. And in fact, he is there and he just gets to preach the gospel, he says, to the whole imperial guard. Imagine being the bloke who is on duty with Paul. What are you going to get for your whole shift? The way Jesus Christ fulfills the scriptures, and he is indeed king. But he says more than that, just that he's there for Christ preaches itself. Think of all of what maybe the other prisoners were at that time under in the imperial guard. You know, as the Romans go through, what's this bloke in for? He's in for, serial theft. Oh yeah, this bloke's in for treason. Oh yeah, we hate those ones. What's this bloke in for? Well, he keeps preaching that there's this someone that's come back from the dead and now he's king. What? What is he doing there? And so Paul says, don't worry. I'm a missionary. I'm under arrest, but the gospel is not. It's as free as it's ever been. But secondly, verse 14, he says there's another reason. And most of the brothers, having become more confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. There are people who have seen what's happened to Paul, and they now have steel in their spine to do the same. Either they see what happens and goes, well, if that's the worst that can happen, of course, let's have at it. Or more likely, it's probable that Rome has their scapegoat. All of their attention is on this case with Paul, and now they get to preach without the heat being on them. Paul goes on to say that there is more preaching happening because I'm in here. And he says some are preaching out of their love for the gospel, love for Jesus. And he says, I love that. Glory to Jesus that that's happening. May there be many more gospel workers raised up in my time. But Paul says there's also those who preach Jesus out of envy and rivalry. It may mean that there's gospel workers that just don't like Paul and they're kind of rubbing it in his face. I think what it actually means, what he's talking about is, his accusers have to say, every single time they make an accusation against him, what do they have to say? What has to come out of their lips? He preaches that Jesus Christ rose from the dead and is now king. And that even in accusation, even in seeking to slander, what are they doing? They are preaching, they are letting people know that Jesus is king. And so he says, I don't care whether it's out of selfishness or sincerity. I don't care because Jesus is proclaimed. I'm still a missionary, friends. It's like he's saying I'm playing with a double-headed penny. I just keep winning. It's just the way it is. Notice what we're getting. We're getting a worldview here. Paul understands that Jesus is actually king. Kings get their way, right? That's kind of the deal with being a king. All things now are going to happen according to this king's will. Maybe not our will, but the king's will. Paul really believes the gospel, that Jesus is the raised from the dead king, that this immense news now casts a shadow over all the comings and goings of all of the people. I wonder if maybe you've seen, those maps. You get a map out and you can see the Roman Empire. It's fun if you watch a time-lapse one, you can see it expand and come back. If you watch it over, a few hundred years, 1,000 years, a long time. And so you can see the colour on the map of where the Romans are. You see where they aren't, and there's other kingdoms, and they press in on it. It's a busy map. Jesus doesn't get a colour on the map. It's as though the map is sitting here, the sun is here, and Jesus stands here, and all of it is just under the shadow of Jesus' rule and reign. Jesus isn't a competing colour. He just is king. Jesus now has a kingship. His will be done. Paul is saying he won't rule in the way we plan it. This looks bad that I'm in chains. My arrest looks like that they have won. But our king is big enough to overshadow this situation. Philippian church, don't miss that your God, Jesus Christ, is ruling and reigning. Goondiwindi church, don't miss that our God laughs when people think his royal proclamation is arrested. For Paul, notice for Paul, this gospel announcement is real. There's a real king. It affects the way we worry. We're concerned for the things that seem like interruptions and full stops. Jesus says they're commas, if that. There's a story unfolding. The gospel is all about a king who takes the worst of human conditions, even death itself, and turns it for his glory. So firstly, don't worry, because this arrest is actually overshadowed by King Jesus. He'll win. He'll keep on winning. He's powerful, sovereign. He is anything but a pretend king. Don't worry. Paul then moves on though. Jesus is overshadowing all things, but he moves on. He is the king who is close in worry. Understand, prison was different in that time. There were no knife fights in the cafeteria line because there was no cafeteria line. There was no cafeteria. Everything you had was supplied by your family and friends. Also remember, Paul was on death row. Life was worth so little in that time, and sometimes the easiest thing to do was get rid of someone. There were processes, sometimes, but death was a real outcome. It could happen with very little notice, without very much ceremony at all. And of course, don't forget, it's shameful to be imprisoned. That was a time when everything was measured by gaining honour and avoiding shame. For the Philippian church, being associated with a shamed person, a jailed person, was also dangerous for their own honour. Paul could feel quite low, couldn't he? But rather than being concerned on any of that, he says there's another reality with me here in prison. He is not alone. He actually says, and he's going to say it lots and lots throughout this letter, he will rejoice. He knows, firstly, he says in verse 19, the Philippian church's prayers are there with him, for him. Who's there with him? Well, on one hand, the Philippians are there with him. He knows that he has these churches that back him, though it might seem like he's shamed. But more than that, he says, with the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance. Now, deliverance should have an asterisk next to it because Paul's going to use it in an interesting way. He seems confident he'll get out, but notice what he says in verse 20. As it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not at all be ashamed, but that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honoured in my body when I am released? No, whether by life or by death. What he's saying when he says delivered, he means either way, either which way I go to the corridor outside the jail cell, whether it's to freedom or to the executioner, he knows that his life and fortunes are so mingled with Jesus. Jesus so fills his horizons, he's going to win either way. Being afraid of death, concerned about things not working out the way you want, having shame, deprivation, loneliness, all those things are displaced by this reality that Jesus is there with him. And so Paul has this really weird, interesting dilemma, doesn't he? Verse 23, he says to depart and be with Christ is far better. He's kind of happy to go that way, down the corridor toward the executioner. Death brings me home, he says. But he also knows that if he stays, well, that means fruitful labour, verse 22. He sums it up in that famous verse we know in verse 21. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. On one hand, Jesus is with me here and I have purpose and meaning. It's good for me, it's good for you. I wouldn't be dead for quids, is what he says on one hand. And yet at the same time, if we're going to talk about ultimate purpose, well, that is to walk with Jesus finally. Paul says, well, that is most preferable. Notice what he's doing. You Philippians don't need to worry. Jesus is in charge. He's the king. He overshadows the whole world. But more than that, he's the king that is with me here in the prison cell. He's the king who stoops to be with us. He's the king who makes a place for us. He's the king who went to death, defeated it. So death is no longer an enemy. Death is now a portal. We get home. He says, I'm playing with a double-headed penny. Again, don't worry. Is that macabre? Is it a bit dark that Christians do this? Because this is how Christians have viewed life throughout the last 2,000 years. Notice, though, it's not that we have a love affair with death. It's not that. Our love affair is actually with life. We say as Christians, viva la vie, long live life. We want to live it now, meaningful, fruitful labour, we get that now, but we also want to live it then too. We want to have our cake and eat it as well, actually. And I would say that those who only believe in this life, well, I would say that's actually macabre. I would say those that believe everything we have is just now, that's got to be the darkest view of life. Surely everything you do in that view is soiled by the fact that everything could be over just like that. Everything you're working on, everything you've ever loved, all falls apart at death, which comes so easily and inevitably. Living like that, to quote Jesus, is like building on sand. All be washed away. But friends, if you love life, if you love meaning, if you love seeing things that last, things beautiful, things good and full, Jesus promises that under his kingship. Never shaken, never taken. Jesus spoke of his people having life and life to the full. Don't worry, Paul says. We have a king who loves life, and he's here with me. Does that mean, to move to our third point, does that mean then we don't worry and we live a happy-go-lucky, are we a breezy group of people, just smiles on our face, float through life all of the time? Well, you know the answer. I want to say yes, but it's not, is it? No. Paul says, don't worry, Jesus is great and big. Don't worry, Jesus is here with me. But he does say, actually, I do want you to worry about something. I do want you to worry about one thing only, he says. He says, worry about the balance. That's when we get to verse 27. Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ. Literally, make sure your response to the gospel, your citizenship in the kingdom of Christ, make sure it balances. Place your life against the weight of the gospel, the weight of grace, and live that out. Don't worry about them and what they say. Don't worry about what might happen to you, but tend to this one thing, that you weigh your life according to the gospel. Make it worthy. He says, it doesn't matter if I'm not around to see it. It doesn't matter if I live or die. Here's the one thing to focus on, that you live in response to the gospel. And he actually goes on to have some descriptions, some examples of what that'll look like. What will your citizenship look like in the second half of verse 27 and following? He says, standing firm, in one spirit with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel, and not frightened in anything by your opponents. It's interesting. Here's what he's saying. Here's how you'll live. He doesn't give a list of moral things to do. He actually just says, stand firm in your love and your loyalty to Jesus. Keep going with him. Be united together in one spirit, one mind. Why? Because it's nice when God's people get along? No. He says, so you can strive side by side for the faith of the gospel. So you can be partners in this great mission we have to bring Christ's kingship everywhere. The word striving, you might be expecting me to say something about koinonia. That's where we were last week. But that's not what he said. The word striving side by side is sun athlon. Together being athletes. And look at us, we are great athletes, aren't we? Maybe not track and field, but he means we are meant to strive together. Be athletes together, contending for this cause. And he says, those that oppose you, don't be afraid of them, because you know which kingdom's going to win. In your courage, that will testify that you stand for the true kingdom, that your salvation, same word as what Paul used as deliverance with the asterisks, your salvation, your deliverance, will indeed be granted, in life or death. Live like you're playing with a double-headed penny. That's what he's saying. Or to put it as Jesus puts it, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Worry about that, and you won't have to worry about anything else. Paul is painting a picture of mission, objective, and implications. He is living a particular mission and objective, and then he lives out the implications. Paul wasn't picking fights around the Mediterranean. He just had a mission. In fact, remember why he's in jail. It isn't just that that Christianity is outlawed and he's going about his business. No, he's in there for implications. He upsets Jews because he says the scriptures that you love and I love, we read it like this. This is how it should be, and they get jealous. He says to other Christians, Jewish Christians, we don't need to have the Gentiles follow law like that. That upsets them. He falls afoul. Implications. We see that actually when he announces that the false gods, the fake gods, the pantheon aren't true, that affects the pagans financially, actually. And so the implication is they chase after him, they kick him out. And so for us, we too, Jesus called, follow me, are to live objective, mission, and the implications will follow. That's what he talks about in verse 29 and 30. For it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ, you should not only believe, we would love it if it finished there. For the sake of Christ, you lot believe in him, but also suffer for his sake. Follow after him, and there will be suffering. There will be implications. He says, engaged in the same conflict that you saw I had and now hear that I still have. Follow Jesus, go after him, balance your life. There will be implications. Suffering, difficulties, hardships. Maybe we know of that. Living life in a fallen world. But I think what Paul actually wants to say, here's the implications. Jesus is king. You get to live in an everlasting kingdom. Jesus is with us. You get to play with a double-headed penny. Life or death, you will receive deliverance. When I wrote, just to finish with this point, this idea, when we agreed on what our mission was as a church, I didn't think about the dual implications of it. This is what it says. I'm thinking of people hearing about us. This is what it says. We seek to live a life worthy, to live worthy of the gospel in every area, speaking and displaying the good news of Jesus Christ, that he might be known through us. We seek to do that, follow Jesus, objective mission, and the implications will be, hopefully, that people hear about Jesus. I didn't think, of course, that would also mean something like what Paul's describing here, that maybe you will also follow Jesus into suffering. But it's possible you will. We can't expect anything else. We follow, have the mission, and we take the implications, no matter what they are. And we can live not worrying, as Paul says, because Jesus has got this. Friends, let me pray for us that we would live as though we're playing with a duck. Let me pray for us.